The autonomic nervous system is the nervous system in control of all involuntary muscles and glands in your body. And the autonomic nervous system is divided into two subdivisions, which are called the sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetic. So I'm going to do the same thing with this comparison. If you look on the next page of your notes, you'll see a space under Anatomic Differences, where we're going to describe the structural differences between the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. The main way that we keep these two nervous systems separate is by saying that sympathetic is the fight or flight nervous system. It's the nervous system that takes control when you're in an emergency or in danger or even just exercising. In the parasympathetic nervous system, we call it resting and digesting, which is the one that's in charge when you're just at rest. It's in charge of your normal body functions most of the time. So for the anatomical differences, I'm going to draw again the brain and spinal cord. And remember, both of these are part of the autonomic nervous system, so they will both have the same target tissues, basically, and they will both have two neurons in the pathway from the central nervous system to the target. So for the target tissues, remember it's cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. So I'm going to draw a heart again as the target for both, because the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic both control heart rate. So when we add the neurons, there are going to be a preganglionic and a postganglionic neuron in both pathways. For the sympathetic nervous system, all neurons begin in what we call the thoracolumbar regions of the spinal cord. That means in the thoracic region, which is the region associated with your ribs and your chest, or the lumbar region. So the middle region of the spinal cord is where sympathetic neurons originate. So I'm going to draw our first neuron beginning right about here. Here's the dendrites and cell body of that preganglionic neuron. And in the sympathetic nervous system, this first neuron that exits the spinal cord is very short. So it ends very close to the spinal cord where it synapses with the second neuron, the postganglionic neuron. So here's our postganglionic neuron, and its axon is relatively long, extending all the way to the target tissue. The preganglionic neuron, remember, is going to be myelinated. There's my myelin sheath I just drew on that axon. And then the postganglionic neuron is not myelinated. In the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron always secretes acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter. The postganglionic neuron always secretes norepinephrine. So the two neurons secrete two different neurotransmitters. So we give them adjectives based on the neurotransmitter they secrete. If a neuron secretes acetylcholine, then we call it a cholinergic neuron. If it secretes norepinephrine as its neurotransmitter, then we call it adrenergic. So in the sympathetic nervous system, the first neuron is cholinergic, the second neuron is adrenergic. And you might be able to imagine the effect that norepinephrine will have on your heart if a sympathetic nerve secretes norepinephrine to your heart. Norepinephrine is chemically similar to epinephrine, which is the same thing as adrenaline. So you know that adrenaline makes your heart beat faster when you're in danger or you're scared. So the sympathetic nervous system, the effect on the heart is that it increases your heart rate. The parasympathetic nervous system will have the opposite effect, and it's structurally different too. The first neuron, the preganglionic neuron for parasympathetic nerves, always begin in the brainstem, way up here towards the brain, or in the sacral region of your spinal cord. No parasympathetic neurons begin in the middle region. Those are where sympathetic neurons originate. So I'm going to draw our first neuron way up here in the brainstem. And the axon of this first neuron, the preganglionic neuron, is really long. Actually, sometimes it goes almost to the target tissue, where it synapses with a second neuron, which is very short, which ends at the target organ. Also remember that the first neuron is myelinated, so here's the myelin sheath of the preganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron is not myelinated, so I won't draw myelin around that. And in the parasympathetic nervous system, both of these neurons are cholinergic, which means that they both secrete acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. So acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter secreted onto heart muscle tissue, and it has a resting effect. It slows down your heart rate to a normal heart rate rather than speeding it up like norepinephrine does. Now, underneath this space where we have drawn this picture, there's another chart that asks questions comparing the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous system. So I'll leave these pictures here and try to squeeze it into the bottom. So we have the sympathetic system versus the parasympathetic system. And the first question is, what region of the brainstem and spinal cord are preganglionic neuron cell bodies located? So remember, in the sympathetic nervous system, those neurons always begin in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. That's the middle of the spinal cord. The parasympathetic begins in the brainstem, which we call the cranial region, and at the opposite end, the sacral region of the spinal cord. The next line says, are preganglionic axons long or short? In the sympathetic nervous system, remember they're short. And in the parasympathetic nervous system, remember that they're long. And it's the opposite for postganglionic neurons. In the sympathetic nervous system, they're long. And then the parasympathetic nervous system, they're short. Are preganglionic axons myelinated? The answer is yes for both. Are postganglionic neurons myelinated? The answer is no for both. Then the last two lines of that chart say, are preganglionic neurons cholinergic or adrenergic? For both sympathetic and parasympathetic, they're both cholinergic. And then are postganglionic neurons cholinergic or adrenergic? For the sympathetic nervous system, they are adrenergic. And then for the parasympathetic nervous system, they are cholinergic. So the gist of the neurotransmitters, the adrenergic versus cholinergic, is just the effect that norepinephrine or acetylcholine will have on the target tissue. So the next thing you're supposed to describe in your notes is the effects that each of these two nervous systems have on target tissues, just specific target tissues that are listed in the chart on the lecture outline.